Again, that's 1 Corinthians 13, verses 8 through 13. And it reads, "Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love."
I want to talk this morning about the keys of love. And we're going to compare and contrast a little bit with what happened yesterday. I just learned about it this morning when I was turned on there's an early morning football game going on in England, and I turned it on as I laid in bed this morning, and they gave a moment of silence for what happened in Pittsburgh and Leicester, England yesterday. So I don't know what happened in Leicester. Heard a little bit about what happened in Pittsburgh yesterday. I was really busy yesterday, never really saw the news or anything. And so I what happened, and went and kind of looked about the guy who went into the synagogue yesterday and shot up a number of people. I think numbers 14 or 11 that he had killed, and wounded a number of others. But I want to compare and contrast, because that behavior and that hatred that the person had that caused that is really the other end of the spectrum of love. And what he did yesterday is very much a contrast to what it means to really love. Because I want you to think about something ahead of time. The person who went into Pittsburgh, and I'll just talk about him, so I don't really know what happened in Leicester, England yesterday, but so he goes in. Obviously, he was motivated to hurt people. Why those particular people, what his particular hatred was, I don't know. I'm sure they'll probably speculate on it for quite a long time, as we do with everybody who kind of commits horrendous actions. The reality is there's all kinds of horrible actions that have happened against people, right? Not all of them hit the news. It's only usually when the body count gets higher that it hits the news. If somebody had done that to one person yesterday in Chicago, for example, would that have hit our news? And probably not. Because we know that lots of people have that motivation, that hatred within them against other people for a variety of different reasons. Because mankind is really good at rationalizing or excusing the reason why we're angry with others. That they have done something, or somebody has taken advantage of me, or something has happened where I am hurt or disenfranchised from others, and we rationalize all kinds of reasons to support often the feelings that we have. But there's a lot more people yesterday that had those feelings of hatred than acted on them, right? Because there's really two different things going on, and it's going to connect in here when we talk about love. Just having the feelings of being angry or hating somebody is not quite the same thing as actually practicing and having your wrath pour out upon them. That's kind of the completion of the hatred. It fulfills it, in a sense, perfects it. It makes it complete. In the exact same way, but for very different purposes, love doesn't mean a lot when it's just felt. Love has to not only be the motivation for us who are trying to be disciples of Jesus, but it then has to be acted upon, or it's really not complete. It's just an emotion. It's incomplete. And so the keys of love, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 13 a bit and a few other places, but he talks about the very end, last verse, the greatest of these is love. Now, in 1 Corinthians 13, 1 Corinthians 13 is a little bit of a parenthetical statement, because you could actually kind of take chapter 12 other than the very last sentence of chapter 12, and you could skip right over into 14 and you would have a continuous thought. But the very last sentence of chapter 12, because in chapter 12 he's talking about spiritual gifts. But he says in the last line, I want to show you a better way, a more excellent way than the spiritual gifts that he was talking about in chapter 12 and in chapter 14. And he says, and that's what chapter 13 is. It's the better way. And what he says is there's three things that we're going to abide beyond spiritual gifts. And that was faith, hope, and love. But he said one of them is better than the others. Love surpasses everything else. It is the great purpose of why Jesus came, of why he paid it all, as we sang, why he gave his life, because he loved us. And that love was completed or perfected at the cross. If he didn't do and didn't follow through, even if he came down from heaven to earth, and at that last moment, if he hadn't said, I could call 10,000 legions of angels to stop you from killing me, if he hadn't said, I could do it, but he said, I am going to do it, and he stopped them from killing him, and he hadn't been executed for our sake, his love wouldn't have been complete. It wouldn't have followed through in his actions with his motives. And that's what we need to kind of understand, is that very often we feel maybe the right things, because sometimes we know we sometimes feel the wrong things, don't we? We're sometimes angry. We're sometimes full of anger and hatred. And we have to get rid of that, and I have to forgive, and I have to let that go. But when I have love, I also can't just let that go. I want to do the right thing. I want to help people. That's nice, but unless acted upon, it's just not really love. It's just an emotion, and it ends up falling short. So let's look at the idea of our motives, because he talks about that, these first three verses, Paul does, before he describes love. And often people turn to 1 Corinthians 13 as a definition of what love does and what it doesn't do. But he starts out in the first three verses, excuse me, talking about his own feelings, his own motives. And he says, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Now, some interesting things going on here. I remember years ago talking about these verses, and a friend of mine, he happened to mention something I hadn't really ever thought about before. And he had said, what if he gave away all he had? If you were somebody who had received all of those gifts he gave away, would that have been a blessing to you? You probably would have felt blessed. You probably would have been grateful for those gifts. But his point here in these passages isn't about what it does for other people. Because sometimes we kind of convince ourselves, well, I helped somebody. I didn't really want to help anybody, but I helped him anyway. I was kind of angry about it and mumbling and murmuring the whole time, but I did it. And we think, well, I did it anyway, so that's okay, right? Little kids do it all the time. You tell them to do a project around that, or their chore around the house, and they go kicking and screaming and scraping their feet along the ground and mumbling and grumbling, and then they do it, and they come to you like, well, aren't you really happy with me? Like, no. Because you didn't, because your motivation and your attitude in that whole process mattered, not just what you did. And sometimes we think it's what we do is all that matters. Jesus actually addressed that quite a bit in the Gospels. He talked about the idea of how they thought, well, as long as I didn't murder my brother, well, then I'm okay. But then he said their problem was they were fine with hating their brother. And he says, you're already murderers because of your hatred for your brother. Now, sure, we don't want to complete that hatred and murder our brother. But what he's saying is you need to go back further and not just stop the action. You need to change the motive. You need to change what is in your thoughts and your hearts. And you need to be honest with yourself, because other people can't always do that. Other people can't always see it. God sees it, and you know it most of the time. But you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be, this is where truth, the real standard of truth is whether I can be truthful to myself. Proverbs talk quite a bit about that idea. But he's talking about doing all of this wonderful stuff, but he says, if my motive wasn't to love other people, then I didn't get anything out of it. And that's true for us as well. It's a little bit like what Jesus talked about prayer. He said to some of the people in his time that they would go out on the street and they would pray so everybody could see them. And he told them, so you think about, well, going out and praying, we'd say, oh, isn't that great? And could you and I know whether that person praying in public was doing it just to be seen or not? Would we always know that? I'm not sure we would always understand the motive. But Jesus talked about that motive. He says, if your motive was just to be seen by other people praying, so they would go, oh, look how righteous and faithful he is. He goes, well, don't think God's going to answer you, because you got what you wanted. You got other people seeing you. The same is true about doing good. Even charitable works. He tells us, don't go around telling everybody all the good you do. He says, do the good for the sake of doing good. Don't make it about you. And so he's talking in the very beginning here about his own motives. If his motive isn't love, it will not profit him in any way, no matter what he does. And that's important for us to understand, that we not only do good things, but that we get our motives right too. That we say, you know what, I'm going to do these good things because God did them for me. And I'm going to pass what he's done for me on to others, which is what he asked me to do. And I'm so grateful for his love and his sacrifice, which was the completion of his love, that I too am going to love other people, even when they're hard to love. I'm going to love other people not just in emotions only, but I'm going to let that love affect how I treat other people and what I do for other people. Now I want you to look back, Philippians chapter 1, or ahead, I guess, in your Bibles, or flip over in whichever form you're reading it. In Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 12, Paul is talking to the church at Philippi, and he's written the book because, for a number of reasons, but he's thanking them for having supported him, and they've sent him some money to help him live and provide for him while he is a prisoner. And he says, starting in verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, what he's referring to about what has happened to him is being arrested. And he's now a prisoner. And he says, but this has actually served to advance the gospel. I'm sure he wouldn't have, when he was arrested and became a prisoner, I'm sure he thought, boy, it'd be so good to get out of here so I could go preach the gospel. Instead, he's going to spend years as a prisoner. But even as a prisoner, he will advance the gospel. And he says, so that it has become throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest of my imprisonment is for Christ. And he says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. He says, so other people are seeing me. I'm still preaching. I'm still speaking in chains. So they keep preaching and they keep talking. But he says in verse 15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Now he mentions something here that I think is really fascinating. And I think we understand this at kind of our core. We know that there are people who preach or teach and let's just say whatever religious kind of teaching that they preach. Some do it for good reasons because they believe it and they think it's right and they do it for God. But I think we all believe that there are those out there that do it for reasons that it's more about money, or it's about prestige, or it's about influence. That there are other motives in people who preach or teach. And I think that's true in almost any profession, isn't it? You can look at people doing any profession, and their motives for doing that profession are going to be different. Some have good motives, and some don't always have good motives. And that's what he said was true in that first century. There were people, just think about the idea. People were out talking about Jesus, being the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior of us all. And they were doing it because they wanted to be better than Paul. They wanted to maybe, rack up more, converts or something. I don't know, maybe they were keeping a little chart of how many they had converted. And he's saying there were people out there doing it because they had envy in their heart. They had rivalry. They had competition going on within them. Some were doing it out of a truly good will. He says the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Just like I talked about helping other people. Sometimes we get kind of caught up in helping people, don't we? I remember it was a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago, we were talking. I think it was one of those times that somebody was bemoaning helping me with my move a few months back. And the number of times they've had to come and help at my house. And I said, well, you offered. And they say, yeah, nobody wants you to take it up. Because a lot of times we do that. We will say to people, oh yeah, if anything I can do, let me know. It's a really nice line, isn't it? And if they come back and go, oh yeah, if you could do this at like 3 in the morning, it'd be awesome. Let me see if that fits in my calendar. Because very often, we want to give the gesture. But sometimes, we're kind of hoping people don't take us up. That the gesture was enough. That I don't have to actually do it. And that's kind of the people who are preaching. They were doing it because they wanted to be something. They weren't doing it so people's lives could be changed by Christ. They were doing it so they would have some kind of prestige. He says, what then? Verse 18, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So he's kind of like going, well, if you helped out of bad motives, I'm glad people were helped. But the point is, did it help you to help other people if your motive wasn't really good? No. This is where we can do things and it doesn't really help us unless our motives are really sincere. And so we're talking about love. We have to really look at ourselves and say, do I really love people? Do I want the best for other people? Or do I sometimes look at some of those Psalms in the Old Testament where David said to God, please go get my enemy. And sometimes we're like that. We kind of wish we probably don't do it because we don't think it's right, but we almost kind of wish God could strike other people. Our motives, looking at our heart, examining, that's kind of why I use that image. Examining our heart. That's, I would love to say, I examine my heart and it's always pure. But in truth, in my lifetime, my heart has not always been pure. It has not always been right. It has not always been sincere and truthful and honest and loving. That when I really look at it and I'm truthful about it, my motives aren't always right. And that's on me. That's on me to change. That's on me to get through that. Find out why. Why am I not wanting to do good or to love others? It's almost always going to come back to, I say almost only because I really always hesitate to say always. It almost always comes back to selfishness. What he talked about here. The former did it out of a selfish ambition. Usually, my motives are bad when something that conflicts with something I want. And that's always the hard part. Do I want it? I want what I want it right now. And then, is it right? Is it not right? Is it good? Is it not good? We got to examine all those things. But look at ourselves. Examine our heart. Do the actions. Because if our motives are really good but we don't do anything about it, it really isn't love. It's just like we talk about when I mentioned the people or the person who killed all the people in the synagogue yesterday. There are lots of people who probably felt similarly to him in the world. There's obviously many, 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 probably millions of people who felt very similar yesterday to what he felt. But they didn't do anything about it. And you and I don't know anything about it. Because his hatred became something we had to deal with when his motives were accompanied by his actions. And in the converse, for us to truly love, our motives of love need to come through in what we do. What do we do for people? How do we help people? I love this kind of picture of just holding an older person's hand there, sitting probably in a wheelchair. Can't take away their pain. You can't take away being old and struggling to walk. But you could sit there and you could hold their hand. And that's something. And it takes sometimes, do we always want to do that? Do we want to visit hospitals? Do you like visiting hospitals? Do you like going and sitting with somebody in a hospital? Most of us probably don't really enjoy it. It's not probably, favorite time of our life. But it's a good thing. It encourages and helps and comforts people. It's a loving action. Now, let's look at these the next verses in 1 Corinthians 13 there. Verse 4 through 8, they really are the definition verses. What love is, what it isn't. And sometimes, I've done it in the past where you kind of put, what it is and what it's not, on separate sides and kind of create a chart out of it. But love is patient and kind, does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. Notice of all those first few things, they're all things it doesn't do versus what it does do. It's patient and kind. Because it's not about envy, which we looked at in Philippians. Some people were preaching the gospel for that reason. It's not about boasting, letting everybody know how good you are, or arrogance, or being rude. It's not having to have it my way. Irritable, resentful. It's not about rejoicing in wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth. Rejoices with what's good and what's loving and kind. That's what he's talking about. Now, this last line, verse 7, it's an interesting thing. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I think this line is somehow or sometimes thought of by people as kind of the reason that Christians are so naive and gullible. That they will just believe anything you say. That they will just kind of, accept any explanation you give. And what's interesting is actually the word for all things. It's actually just a single word. And it's something that means kind of everything or each one of something, but it's a word that means each of some group of things. And so what he's talking about is bears all things. In that class of things that should be bared with, love bears with all of them. But are there some things you shouldn't bear? Yeah. That's not in that class of all things that should be bared with. I don't know if hopefully that makes sense. But that's kind of what he's talking about here. When things should be bared with, you should bear with them. That's what love does. When things should be believed, you should believe them. Now, when things shouldn't be believed, there are times when you shouldn't believe somebody. It's like every parent has had a child do something. You watch them do it, and you ask them about it. They could even have something broken in their hand, like put it behind their back. And did you break that? Oh, no. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, well, you don't believe them, right? And you shouldn't believe them because you have evidence to the contrary. But when you don't have evidence, when you should believe people, then you believe them. That class of that's us giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's like, well, you're just kind of the kind of person who might say something and might lie, so I'm not going to believe you. No. I'm going to trust you unless proven otherwise, unless demonstrated otherwise. He says, I hope in all things. Not everything is hopeful, but everything that should be hoped for, I should hope for. Endures all things. Again, just like bearing with things. Not everything is supposed to be bared with. Not everything is supposed to be endured. Some things you should deal with and not just endure it or bear it. But if it should be endured or bared, love does that. But very often we don't like to endure and bear things that we ought to because that's harder. And so it's easier to be kind of like, cut people off. Or I'm not going to put up with that anymore. But love sometimes puts up with it longer than we would like. Right? I want to look at a couple of passages here. 1 Peter 8, or 1 Peter 4, verse 8, I should say. He talks about this idea of love as well. and encourages Christians to have this kind of love. He says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. This is an interesting kind of line, the idea of covering sins, because, love is patient and kind, and it covers people's sins. What does that mean? Does that mean you hide them and pretend they weren't real, and you just kind of ignore them? Is that what covering sins means? Let's look at Proverbs 17:9. Because actually, Proverbs 17:9 says this there's a few Proverbs that do it. This is one of them. In Proverbs 17, verse 9, it talks about this idea. Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. So notice, in Hebrew poetry, by the way, when you have two sentences, they usually they connect to each other in some way. And this one gives the opposites. So covering an offense versus repeating it. So what he means by covering is by not spreading it around. You see somebody sin, and you go, hey, you know what so-and-so did? To a bunch of other people. That's not love. Love covers them. And what I want you to go do is turn over to Luke chapter 10. This is the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 is given by Jesus when Jesus had been being grilled and was being asked, what's the greatest commandment? To love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And he then gave the second commandment, which is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And a lawyer, basically an expert in the law of Moses, a lawyer stood, and he was trying to kind of puff himself up. Oh yeah, who's my neighbor? It's like, yeah, that's the really difficult question. And so the story of the Good Samaritan is about who is my neighbor. And the Samaritan was neighbor. The others weren't. The priest and the Levite weren't. But I want you to see what he does for this man. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. So, stripped him could have been just all his outer clothing, could have had just some kind of undergarment still on, but he might have had nothing on. So here comes the three different men. A priest comes by, sees the guy bloody and beaten and laying there almost half dead. And what does he do? Avoids him. Levite comes by. What does he do? Avoids him. Then a Samaritan comes by and sees him. And he says in verse 33, as the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Do you think, let's say he had been completely stripped of his clothing, and he had no clothing, do you think he would have taken a blanket or maybe his own coat and he would have given it to him as a covering? The same exact kind of thing we see happen when people sometimes in a natural disaster for some reason have to flee with their lives and don't have enough clothes on for some reason, and a stranger comes by and gives them a blanket or gives them a coat. Right? We cover them, right? That's the idea of covering sin. We're helping them. It's not a matter of allowing them to continue in sin. That's not loving and kind. But it is a matter of not taking their sin and broadcasting it out to everybody else. Going and helping them cover it. Now, obviously, their sins can only be covered by the blood of Christ. But each of us can help them in their sin. That's what love does. Love seeks to help them, not to, make or ridicule them or make an example of them in kind of a bad way, but to cover people's troubles, to cover people's shame. Colossians chapter 3, another kind of idea about love that Paul wrote, and I kind of Colossians 3 and verse 12. We'll end with these verses here this morning. Starting verse 12, he says, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts." Now you notice what he started with there, kind of what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians? Your motives. You need motives about love and compassion. That needs to be at our heart and our soul. That is the beginning of love. It's not the end of it. That's not all there is to it, but it's the beginning. And without it, you're going to struggle to love anybody. So put on the whole compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body. This is ultimately how the unity and peace happens. It's when we don't cause these to be in our heart and in our practices, that what it leads to is hatred growing within us. It leads to us not doing those things that are good and kind, that are patient and loving and merciful and compassionate, and helping others in whatever difficult situations they find themselves. So if we really want to love, and that's really our theme for this quarter, Jesus said, in the passage that we had there in the beginning, opening welcome screens, that if we truly, people will know we are His disciples by our love. That is the mark of being a Christian. A love that is different than the world's type of love, which loves only when it expects love in return, but won't love those who hate them, won't love those who ridicule them or speak evil of them. And too much right now in our society and all over the world, hatred is kind of growing and anger is growing and fomenting. And I'm sure I heard it a lot this morning, people talking, we're going to talk to psychiatrists and what's happening. We have all kinds of social media and groups. What do we do in social media? We connect to those of like-mindedness. And for people who are hating one another, what does their hatred, how do they foment each other? They grow in their hatred. Well, we need to grow our love for one another. We need to grow and do it for each other and have it be done to us and have it be practiced among us so that others seeing it might do it and seek it as well.